right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. We wanted to throw these slides up on the screen while we waited for people to come in, but I think we waited long enough, so I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And Xavier, if you want to go ahead and get us started.
Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this, our third now virtual meeting of the Underwater Homeowners Association, a group created in Pinecrest, the village of Pinecrest, back during the fall of 2008 for Art Basel, and with our first official meeting where we elected Brian House as our chair on January of 2019. So we're now almost a year and a half into this project. And again, we have to go, if everyone could just mute their phones, we had to go online because obviously of the COVID pandemic. And as I think I've mentioned every single time since I have started these meetings, the lessons learned during the pandemic are absolutely to resonate with us as we focus our energies on a problem that impacts us individually but collectively, on a problem that is exacerbated by climate change, on a problem that can paralyze economies, hurt people, endanger all of life as we know it. Clearly, sea level rise, rising seas do that. That's why we're all here meeting on a regular basis, trying to learn from one another and work together to solve it, as is the pandemic. And I just want to let you know, I went into the website. One of the other projects I work on here at the Cortado Projects platform is the Miami Corona project. And that is a project where I look at the Department of Health on a daily basis. And today, just a few minutes ago, I went to their website, and 1,000 today is the 1,000th death of a Miami-Dade County resident. And I know all of us are itching to get out of our homes. All of us are wanting to get back to normal. And although this is going to be a hopeful meeting, because there's not a meeting about us being in despair or angsting, there's a meeting of problem solvers, people who are looking to solve the problems of the future, problems that are invisible, problems that aren't palpable. That's what this group is about. It's about bringing our community wisdom together to impact change. And we're now sitting here on our homes instead of being at Books and Books or at Pinecrest Gardens having this meeting because of a problem that, again, is exacerbated by the issues of climate change. Right? Obviously, pandemics spread because of our encroachment into wilderness and our interconnectedness as a planet and our lack of preparedness or lack of prioritization, lack of understanding future needs as opposed to instant gratification and in too many ways greed puts us in situations like this one. So today, as we launch this meeting and as we plan for a better future and as we figure out how we're going to adapt, how we're going to mitigate, and yes, how we are going to eventually migrate, I just want to put the pandemic in perspective for all of us and acknowledge that there are 1,000 families, 1,000 workspaces, 1,000 group of friends who have abruptly lost someone. And I just want to make sure that the same way we should sacrifice a little more even today as our state promises or looks to be the next epicenter of this pandemic, that we need to sacrifice today to lessen the suffering in the future. And by future, we mean the next year, the next 2-3 years with this pandemic. Likewise, this Underwater HOA group is convened so we can ask our policymakers to look beyond 2- and 4-year timelines and look at what's going to happen in Miami-Dade County 30 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now. So I'm sorry to be so honest, but this is what this group is here to do. That's why we are a group that sees into the future and tries to bring everyone's attention on that horizon. So with that, I'm going to change this backdrop that just literally tells you how many people have been infected in Miami-Dade County and how many have died to today. And I'm going to now switch it and bring us into the Underwater HOA meeting. And before I go ahead and introduce our the panels and what we're doing today, I'd like for our director to direct. First of all, I want to give a shout out to Jamal Wilson for preparing that introductory slide. So thank you, Jamal. He is our University of Miami master's student who volunteers to coordinate the Underwater HOA under Adam Roberti's leadership as the full-time director of Cortado Projects. But let me turn it over to Adam real quick so he can tell us how to get these backdrops here, and also to tell us what's going to happen with the meeting as it ends, so that we can break up into our committees. So Adam, take it away.
Great, thanks, Xavier. So as you guys would have read in the emails that you all received, the markers that we have behind us are the same markers that we've been using for years at this point to catalyze conversation around climate change in our communities. Sorry if my shoulder disappears. And what we've done is made it accessible for a Zoom backdrop. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just put the link in here in case you want to do it now or later. So you can go there, and on that website there is the citizenize.org app, and that's where you can type in the address of your home and figure out your elevation. And once you know your elevation, then you can find the marker that best fits you, best fits your property. So anyway, feel free to do that if you'd like to. And what I'll say now, moving on from the markers, is that we have a couple of speakers here today. We have Christian speaking very quickly from the Office of Resilience, and I'll let the proper introductions be done, as well as Sonia Chao from the University of Miami. However, after that, we're going to be, for the first time, breaking into our subcommittee sessions, if you will. So we have Dr. Brian House, who's the chair of the Pinecrest Underwater HOA chapter, and so we will be, those of you who selected to go into his group afterward will be automatically transported into that room. And there are a few of you that decided to join neither, and that's fine. You're welcome to leave the meeting as soon as Sonia's Q&A is done. And then the rest of you will be joining me in my room for the engagement and programming breakout session. And so we'll go into more of those details individually once we're in those separate rooms. So I just wanted to give you guys that introduction. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it back over to Xavier, and we'll get the meeting started.
Great, thanks so much, Adam. So yeah, today we have actually two presentations. Before we have our featured speaker, my colleague and friend at the University of Miami School of Architecture, I want to introduce to you Christian Kamrath, who is the Resiliency Coordinator for Adaptation for the Miami-Dade County Office of Resilience, where he supports the development of Miami-Dade County sea level rise strategy, outlining systems-wide impacts, landscape types and adaptations approaches, supporting land use and investment tools, and key implementation policies and projects that advance the equitable resilience building countywide. As the Resilience Coordinator for Adaptation, Christian assisted with the coordination and technical evaluation of the recently released U.S. Army Corps of Engineers back base study, which, according to the Army Corps, is designed to reduce storm surge that accounts for sea level rise. Christian joins us tonight to speak about the study and share with the Underwater HOA community how to give their feedback and make sure that our voices get heard by those in the county government tasked with forming sea level rise impact plans on the public behalf. As you may know, we also have organizations that I consider to be sister organizations and partner, and that is the Miami Waterkeeper and CLEO, two very, very strong, in fact, I'll say it, my favorite environmental groups in this community, and I really respect their leadership. I've put links that they have been sharing with our community on their website about this study. I know that our chair has also had conversations in many of our meetings about this back-based study. So aside from getting the information from our county, which is one of our strong partners in implementing other projects, Jim Murley and the entire Office of Resilience in the county, I also want you to please look at the perspectives of both CLEO and the Miami Waterkeeper. They're concerned about making sure that our community voices are really heard by the Army Corps of Engineers, and that what probably most of us would agree with, that green infrastructure, again, a favorite topic of our featured speaker, is also brought into the equation as we begin to plan for Miami's future. So having said that and putting it all in perspective, and I'll ask Brian to please also comment at the end, not just your capacity, Brian, as clearly the chair of our group, but also as the person who oversees the Sustain Laboratory at Rasmus, which is as relevant as it gets for storm surge issues. So with that, Kristen, I really appreciate you taking your time to coming and speaking to us here for about 7 minutes today. Thank you, Kristen. Welcome.
Of course. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes? Awesome. Great. I'll be brief. I'm going to try to share my screen so I can kind of pair what I'm saying with a few visuals. So give me one moment while I do that. Or I don't know if...
You should have the ability to.
Okay, perfect. So, thank you so much, Xavier, Adam, and particularly Jamal for helping me become a part of this process and being allowed to talk with you guys today about a study that is ongoing with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So as Xavier mentioned, our Office of Resilience does a lot of more holistic sea level rise, climate adaptation planning work. But most recently, we've been serving as what they call the local sponsor for this federal study, which has this very long name, but we basically call it, in short, a Back Bay Coastal Storm Risk Management Study. So to give you just a brief overview of what the study is, what its purpose is, some of you may have been involved in previous outreach efforts or heard about it through our newsletter. I'm going to talk about that and then also show you quickly how you all can submit formal comments as part of the draft plan. So just an overview. Let me get this out of the way for us. So the study is a 3-year fully funded study. It's fully funded by the federal government, congressional appropriation, but it is designed to reduce damages of coastal storms while considering sea level rise. So it's really focused on reducing the impacts of future storm surge. And it's really focused on this area, the urbanized area of Miami-Dade County. So it's not considering, other federal lands or as many of natural areas. So it's looking to protect human environment and infrastructure. We're in the middle of this 3-year study. We're halfway through, and it was a few weeks ago that the Corps released their draft plan, which then opened up what we're in now, the 45-day public comment period, which is really the most important time for folks to be commenting and making their voice heard before we move on to sort of the next couple of phases. I do want to be clear because it can get confusing, but this study is done through a specific authorization through Congress, and so its scope, not only is it limited to 3 years to tackle what is a very complex problem, but the Corps is only authorized to really look at a few specific things, which as an office that likes to look at things holistically, is a challenge. But basically, just to understand what they are authorized to do is look at damages to future storm surge that consider sea level rise. So knowing that storm surges of the future will inherently impact our community more with sea levels that are higher in the future. Since we're midway through the study, there'll be a couple of phases of kind of iteration for the study. But even at the end of next September in 2021, this is a very conceptual design and process. And so it'll end up with what we call a 10% design. So 100% design means we know exactly where things are going, how high they'll be, all sorts of things. But it's a very conceptual process. What's not authorized is to look at how to mitigate impacts of just pure like tidal or king tide flooding, which I know something we're all very concerned about. I just want to make that clear up front. I'm not going to read through all of these now. And by the way, all of these slides are on the Army Corps' website. These are just an excerpt of their presentation that they've been giving at some public meetings. We have a number of problems, opportunities, objectives, and constraints with a project like this. So I'm not going to read over these now, but again, you can come back and look at these later. What the Corps did, kind of process-wise, they are tasked with developing specific measures that will reduce storm surge damage. So what they did was take what's known as a social vulnerability index, which is basically a set of 15 different sort of factors that encompass these different themes to identify groups or populations within the community who might be impacted more so by a storm surge. They overlaid those most socially vulnerable areas with areas that were most physically vulnerable to future storm surge. So what they did basically was we're running a series of complex flood models, but they were looking at what we call a 1% annual chance hurricane event with up to 4 feet of sea level rise built into it. So this is looking basically given projections that they use, looking at what would a really bad hurricane, category 4 or 5 hurricane do in the year like 2079. So really looking out 50 years from when, from 2030. But anyway, that's what they're considering. And what that led to were these 7 focus areas that are sort of, this is the crossover of those 2 indices. There are 7 focus areas, and they went through, we were asking questions along the way, and there was public feedback kind of along the way, but it ended up with a series of different management measures. There's structural measures, so walls, floodgates, storm surge barriers, non-structural measures, sort of like elevating homes or floodproofing larger buildings so that floodwaters are less impactful. We're looking at critical infrastructure across the county, so our fire stations, hospitals, evacuation centers, etc. And then natural and nature-based features, which is kind of their term for green infrastructure. So they considered those. And after a couple of different iterations, what this plan that came out recently is really proposing is what they call the tentatively selected plan. So it involves a number of things, including flood wall and flood barriers around Brickell in the downtown area, the Miami River, elevating or floodproofing homes in these colored areas. Those are those 7 focus areas. Several mile-long flood wall going from about Northeast 61st Street all the way up north through Miami Shores to 100 and 25th Street. So there's, and as well as some restoration of wetlands and mangroves down in Cutler Bay. So I know I'm short on time, but I'm just going to quickly point to the Army Corps' website where more information can be found and where you can provide public comments. So I will add the link. This is the homepage for the study. There's a lot of information. There's an overview video on the center of the page. The actual study itself is nearly 1,000 pages long. Our office and many other stakeholders are critically evaluating and reading through this. But the way you provide comments is found here over on the right. And I can easily summarize this to make sure it gets out to all following this meeting. But you can basically either email formal comments, and it could just be an email or a letter to this email address. And then there's an online ArcGIS tool that allows you to comment directly on it. So this is just a preview of what that looks like. And you're able to add comments and click on the map and add comments directly on it. So I know I'm a minute or 2 over time, so I'll just stop there. I'm happy to answer questions later on if there's time, but with that, I'll pass it over to Xavier, and yeah, appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thanks, Christian.
Yeah, thank you, Christian.
Hey, Christian, can you unshare your screen for a second? And Christian, can you hear me? Also, Christian, if you would please put use our chat room to put the links that you just talked about. Just take your time to please do those things. Kristen, I don't know what your time is like. Are you needing to leave this meeting now? Because we're having some issues with breakout rooms, and there's a deadline for this, the deadline that we're trying to push, but there is a deadline for the submission of these comments, right? When is that deadline?
Yep, that deadline is July 20th.
Yeah, so we're not going to have another Underwater HOA meeting before then. And again, we can do this on our own, especially with the leadership of our chair and some of the experts who are in the room. But Adam, is it okay with you if we postpone the breakouts? And Brian, is it okay with you if we have you lead us through some sort of discussion on how we as individuals and perhaps as a group want to respond to this? This is something you've been talking about for months. Would that be a pretty...
Yeah, exactly. So you mean after Sonia gives her presentation,
exactly.
Instead of breaking out, we go into a discussion. Yeah, I think that'd be appropriate. It's really important.
Let's do that. And I'm going to have you, if you don't mind, lead that whole effort. And if Kristen could stick around, it would be great. But that way we can devote, I mean, this is as critical as it gets to for us. And when we invited you, Kristen, the deadline, we had already had our featured speaker, and the deadline did not dawn on me that it was so here. We are trying to push it. Is there any chance that deadline is going to get moved for comment?
There is a chance. We have requested it to be so. So if we're hopeful, because yeah, everyone's under very unique, unprecedented circumstances.
Yeah. Well, let's just please, if I can, have everyone allow us to do this. And I'm sorry, Adam, I know you put a lot of work into our sub meetings, but let's just make this a committee, the whole type of thing, led by Brian after Sonia is done speaking and doing Q&A, and let's just go straight into how we respond to this, because this is wait till Brian tells you a little bit more about what's in the plan. I mean, we are going to want to have a comment. Okay, Kristen, so appreciate you being here. All right, and with that, Brian, let me, I was gonna ask you to comment on what Kristen brought up now, but let's just go ahead and begin with Sonia's presentation. If you would take charge of the meeting, and then after the Q&A that I will moderate, you'll go ahead and lead us through a whole discussion on this. Does that make sense, Brian?
Yeah, sure, that makes sense. I mean, I'm sure that there's other people that can contribute on the document itself. It's particularly Christian on some of these things. It'd be great to have him here to answer more questions in detail. So it's our pleasure as the Underwater Homeowners Association Pinecrest to have Sonia Chao here to speak with us. I've been working with Sonia now for several years. It's been great getting to know her through the University of Miami and our research program there, and it's amazing what a diverse set of interests she has that are directly relevant to the program, what we're concerned about here in terms of South Florida and coastal resilience. Sonia is a faculty of the architecture school, I'm sorry, architecture school at the University of Miami. She's the director of the Center for Urban and Community Design. And she is involved in a lot of different things in the community activities as well as educational programs. She's the director of the Master of Professional Science and Urban Sustainability in the School of Architecture, and is a faculty research fellow in climate and the environment at the Institute for Advanced Studies of the Americas. And one of the things that's really relevant that she's been doing to this whole program in South Florida with concerned about the Army Corps of Engineers is studies on the connection between built and social layers in the city. Her focus there has been primarily on Miami Beach, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, it's a great pleasure to have Sonia here. She can explain her work in more detail and take it away.
Thank you, Brian, for a very kind introduction. My thanks to you and to Xavier for this invitation, and to Jamal for helping make all of that happen today. I'm going to break my presentation down into 3 parts, and I will start by sharing my screen. And there we go. So the presentation that you'll see today is hopefully brief. It is broken down into 3 different parts. The first one is going to be a little bit more technical. It is trying to summarize for you really briefly a study that we did that tried to look at assessing building vulnerability in coastal areas, and how that particular study, thanks to NSF funding, which is the National Science Foundation, we were able to, think about coastal vulnerability and resilience from a human-centered perspective, as Brian mentioned. We did that by analyzing paradigms that we thought were consistently occurring across the eastern seaboard. And we were doing that from an urban morphology perspective, from a geological morphology perspective, from a building type perspective, as well as trying to understand the socioeconomic stressors and variables. The second work that I'll show you today are a series of pamphlets that we've been working on in a pro bono manner that intersect resilience and preservation. And the last thing that I'll show you very kind of briefly is our response after Hurricane Irma to thinking about post-disaster resilient housing in the Caribbean and what that might look like in response to FEMA's current rollouts of mobile homes. And so the initial study that I did was in conjunction with Benjamin Gansa, and it was part of a larger NSF grant that I was lucky to work with colleagues not only at the University of Miami, but also at the University of Virginia Tech and the University of Colorado, led by our College of Engineering peer, Land Off-Road Barbarigos. And I went, we also had an opportunity to engage many of our students. What I'll be talking to you about today is specifically storm surge. And so as to not, to make it easier for those of you that may be less familiar with what that might mean, that of course, hopefully my laptop assists. There we go. Storm surge is, of course, going to vary according to the intensity of a hurricane. It also has a lot to do with how the land just beyond our shores is set up. You know, is it steep? Is it shallow? And a series of other variables. But in our case, we have a string of barrier islands that are frequently on the front side of a lot of these storm surge impacts. And so that was one of the reasons that we decided to focus on the barrier island as one of our paradigms. So we also...
This is a candy bar.
Okay.
And this is a piece of popular whole wheat bread.
Sorry.
Would you be shocked if I told you this slice of...
Skip that.
A lot of talk about the storm surge.
Okay, sorry about that. All right, and so going back, close that. What I'll have for you now is a very brief presentation that I just submitted, that I just did recently. I thought it was the best way to, in a very compact amount of time, give you an overview. It's about 10 minutes long, and then I'll come back and summarize briefly for you some of the other initiatives that I just outlined, and then we can have a Q&A at the end. Okay, here we go.
Welcome. On behalf of my colleague Benjamin Gansa and myself, I thank you all for joining this session. My name is Sonia Chao, and I am a faculty member at the University of Miami School of Architecture. And today I will be summarizing rather briefly a portion of our National Science Foundation funded research, which focused on assessing the vulnerability of coastal buildings to storm surge flooding. The study comprised 3 different types of geological, urban, and building type scenarios understood as paradigms along the eastern seaboard. This presentation focuses on only one of the case study sites and on one of those paradigmatic conditions, which is to say the barrier island of Miami Beach. As you know, low-lying coastal areas across the globe are increasingly challenged by stronger and more frequent related climate events, extreme weather events, in fact, as well as to rising seas due to warmer and expanded ocean waters, thereby aggravating existing conditions, be they economic, physical, or social frailties. Here we see a map of the study area showing Miami-Dade County, Miami Beach, and the buildings selected in our transit cut for this study. Miami-Dade County, of course, is located in the southeastern portion of the state of Florida, and it is among the most vulnerable locations along the eastern seaboard due to its combination of risk factors, which include sea level rise, given its geology, low-lying elevation, and its geographic location, so close to the Gulf Stream. Our aim was to develop a human-centered computational model capable of assessing the impacts of storm surge action on buildings themselves, utilizing parameters that reflect the particularities of a given built or urban context. To that end, we dissected and analyzed the building and urban features of these contexts. This would allow for a finer grain understanding of a community's overall risks from one parcel to the next, which can in turn better inform evolving disaster reduction strategies. Our study resulted in the development of what we named the Storm Surge Building Vulnerability Model, or Ssbb for short. So I'm going to summarize for you the methodology and the study area, and I'm hoping that if you'd like more information, that you'll take a look at the paper that's being published by the ACSCA, where you'll find much more detailed explanations. And if you'd like more information of all the 3 case study sites, then we are preparing a publication, and I hope you'll look for that in the future as well. So firstly, our study area. As you can see from this illustration, it was a segment of what is popularly known as South Beach. Within that setting, we zoomed in on one of the most vulnerable neighborhoods. The transect swath that we selected was in fact done so in consultation with the various planning, preservation, and emergency management, environmental, as well as resiliency officers. And it cuts across the Flamingo Park Historic District and the Ocean Drive Collins Avenue Historic Districts, both which are located just south of the Lincoln Road area. Those 2 historic districts are largely comprised of 2 to 4 story buildings in their central portion. And there is one area that has single family homes to the west of the park, as you can see here, just above where it says Flamingo Park on the slide. And instead, on the 2 edges of the case study sites along the 2 waterfronts, there are areas which host larger buildings, sometimes condominiums, other times hotel buildings, and many times they are located above parking decks, in particular on the western side, and they have larger footprints as well. As you can see in this image, this particular cross-section that we selected of island made possible the analysis of a variety of adjoining urban intensities, building typologies, structural types, and construction periods. It also presented different topographies and contextual features, including a natural defense system on its eastern edge, which is to say a 13.5-foot high enhanced dune, which also coincided with the highest elevation point in our case study site. Within the selected cross-section of South Beach, all 297 buildings were included in the study. Various data sets were referenced in this study. GIS data obtained from the University of Miami's library included numerous city infrastructure features, including shapefiles of buildings, transportation infrastructure, parks and recreational areas, coastal and inland water bodies, and other land use and land cover types. The data also included shapefiles and block groups, artificial reefs, and FEMA firm zones. The main raster data sets were from the DEM and the SLOSH models. In addition, a synoptic survey or a field research was carried out to gather ground truth information of various data sets, as well as of new ones. This included the number of stories in a building, the presence and the type of garden walls, and a standardized accounting of the finished floor elevations. This intersection of quantitative and qualitative data allowed for a more accurate calibration of our storm surge building vulnerability model in the subsequent phase. I should also mention the study used Microsoft Excel and the Macbeth software for the modeling process, and our results were displayed in Esri ArcGIS. Now, the physical vulnerability assessment involved determining the nature of a building and its neighborhood characteristics that exposed it to extreme storm surge flooding. Similar studies assessing the physical vulnerability of buildings by Daloso and Domini Ho in 2009 and others later on used a multi-criteria decision-making approach to evaluate the resulting impact of conflicting criteria on buildings in the event of a hypothetical natural or human-made disaster. In this study, the parameters selected for the vulnerability were fundamentally based on FEMA's ground truth observations of the characteristics and damage to buildings caused by historical storm surge flooding along the eastern seaboard of the US. The FEMA observations and reports following Hurricanes Andrew, as you can see on the left, but also Wilma and Irma, state that floodwater depths, distance from the floodplain, nature of building design and construction, the flood or foundation type, and the age of buildings and site location were the prevailing determinants of the level of damage to buildings due to storm surge flooding. In addition, published literature on the characteristic effects of various storm surge flooding events on buildings helped us to select the parameters of our multi-criteria evaluation. From those resulted our selection of 6 parameters, which we grouped into 2 categories. Firstly, the exposure category that included floodwater depth and distance from the floodplain, and the second category, which was the building design category, that included the number of stories, construction type, finished floor elevation, and the year built. This is an illustration of that last of the categories. In this presentation, I do not have the opportunity to review the nuances of each and every one of those parameters, but our paper does provide all the related information. And there might be some surprises in there. For example, for those who incorrectly assume that the older buildings performed worse, for example. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about the weighing process itself. It resulted in the determination of a robust numerical values as weights were based on the importance between the different parameters. The exposure parameters carried the highest weights, followed by the parameters indicating the nature of the building. Applying the weights to the proportional parameters and then normalizing them resulted in what you can see here is our second equation, which defines the vulnerability of buildings to storm surge flooding located in the study area. By applying that equation to each building and displaying the results in ArcMap, showed the spatial distribution of the vulnerability of buildings within the study area, which you can see here. That resulting map shows that vulnerability of buildings does not have a simple distribution pattern as we would assume from other ways of mapping vulnerability, but rather it depends on attributed parameters for each building. From the map generated, we can ascertain the following, and these are now drawings that we produced. The western and eastern front lines, which are closest to the water bodies and the floodplains, have very low and or low vulnerabilities. The observation at the eastern end can be attributed to the location of high-rise buildings there, at times with habitable floors located above one or more levels of open parking decks. There is also, as I mentioned, a tall dune running along the eastern edge of the barrier island, which adds to the protection of structures closest to it in particular. Most of the western buildings facing the bay are also high-rise structures. Many are hotel condominium buildings that are 20 stories and above. Now, though at the two fringes of the transect you have the lowest elevations and thus have the highest exposure compared to other parts of the study area, the structural stability of the high-rise buildings due to their foundation types and the presence of more habitable floors, and many of those, as I mentioned before, being located more than one floor above the ground plane, and are similar to those facing the ocean, and the numerous habitable spaces that provide multiple floors where people can be safe during any major extreme weather event to storm surge action, as well as their property, resulted in these buildings demonstrating the attributes of very low and low vulnerability. I'm not saying it's safe to be in these buildings during a storm, just saying that it's safer in relation to storm surge action. Now, in addition to the number of stories and habitable spaces located above parking decks, some building parcels are partially filled, thus located on a higher elevation relative to the other parts of the study area, explaining the cluster of very low and low vulnerability there. The high and very high vulnerability are located in the middle section of the case study site. Buildings in these areas are usually 2 to 4 stories high and have either slab on grade or crawl space finished floor elevations. Commonly, buildings in this area were built prior to 1965 or otherwise between 1965 and 1992 when Hurricane Andrew hit. Buildings constructed between 1965 and 1992 were found to be more vulnerable due to the methods of construction employed during that window of time. In conclusion, the storm surge building vulnerability model assessed the vulnerability of coastal buildings to storm surge flooding using Miami-Dade County sites as case study areas. And we selected parameters based on FEMA's reports of the observed damages and buildings that caused damage to these buildings by hurricanes, as well as available literature. And out of the total 297 buildings considered in the model, 101 evidenced moderate vulnerability, 73 high vulnerability, and 6 of very high vulnerability. Of the 79 buildings that exhibited a high and very high vulnerability, which is to say approximately 70% of them, that is 55 of them were in fact slab-on grade buildings. Most of the very low and low vulnerability buildings are high-rise buildings and were located behind the tall dune. It can be concluded from this study that the vulnerability of buildings to storm surge flooding is dependent on the nature of the building's constructive features, its relationship to the ground plane, and to the contextual features in its immediate vicinity, as opposed to only the flood hazards present within the zone. This study provides, we hope, useful protocols to analyze and interpret the many variables of vulnerabilities of coastal buildings in hurricane situations. And further studies will allow us to understand to what degree our storm surge building vulnerability model may need to be adjusted in order to be applicable to a broader context along the eastern seaboard. I thank you for joining us today for this session.
All right, thank you, recorded Sylvia. Now we have, or Sonia, Jesus, Sonia. Now we have an opportunity to ask Sonia questions here.
Actually, let me finish, Brian, if I could, with the rest of the presentation, then I'll be happy to take the rest of the questions, if that's all right. Is that okay?
Oh yeah, sure. My apologies.
Okay. No, no worries. So really quickly, just wanted to associate that research with some research that we've done more recently that has very much focused on social vulnerability itself. This time we did look at other locations, the East Little Havana neighborhood in particular. And the study, of course, also used GIS data as well as demographics and socioeconomic data of the block groups to perform the principal component analysis. What that resulted in was our being able to look at things such as the household sizes, average income, median age, and the main were, of course, the main determinants of social vulnerability within the block groups. And in this diagram that you could see here on the left, essentially our results indicated that very high and high vulnerability areas were in neighborhoods where you had a tendency to have higher density, where you had larger family sizes, where you had low income earners all intersecting. The next project that I'm going to talk to you about really quickly is a pro bono project that I'm doing in collaboration with students at the School of Architecture through our Center for Urban and Community Design, as well as with my colleague Landolph Red-Barbarigos at the College of Engineering and with the City of Miami's Resilience and Preservation officers. And I have to be very thankful to Dade Heritage Trust, because it's thanks to a small grant that they gave us that we were able to, in fact, have the students collaborate with us on the project. Essentially, these very short pamphlets are made available or will be, I should say, made available in the coming months to residents in South Florida. The first one, going back to it, as you can see here, we essentially were looking at East Little Havana, and we were looking at the single family house as a type, and we illustrate for the reader characteristics about this particular neighborhood, but also start to introduce them to how resilience and preservation meet, sometimes at odds with each other, by providing them with some background history as to some of our vulnerabilities and the stressors and shocks that we're constantly having to deal with, but also with definitions of new terms that may be useful to individuals that want to start to learn more about how they can, in fact, become more resilient, whether that be by initiating the process and preparing, by learning basic information through the FEMA firm maps and other resources that our local and federal government have available to us, to learning more about how they can, in the short term, defend their property by what we call dry proofing, which is when you try to keep the water outside of any existing building, and what are some of the strategies that one could use in that scenario, versus what we might want to do to adapt. On the left-hand side, you can see a couple of different scenarios. We know that in some cases, as you can see from the dotted line, streets are going to be raised in certain neighborhoods. And so we've already started to see that in places like Miami Beach, of course. And we were trying to illustrate how there could be ways for, adaptation strategies, as you could see here, a couple of them having to do with lifting buildings, others with having to do with filling. All of these rather expensive. Or at least potentially so, and depending on the building type that you have or the construction type. So, which is to say, if you have a wood frame building, for example, those are easier to lift up than a masonry building. And we also try to look at other building types, so the multifamily building type, and on this occasion, looking at the Art Deco style buildings in Miami Beach, and how, again, there are different strategies that they could use there for their process. And we also looked at sustainability issues, both at the scale of buildings and at the scale of the neighborhood and the parcel, so as to introduce notions of how one could mitigate their carbon footprint. And then we ended up with a chapter that looks at how one can start to think about relocation and or rebuilding on sites, as well as introducing concepts related to the larger picture, so that folks always consider the larger neighborhood that they may be impacting by whatever decisions they make. And so that's one project, or two projects that are almost complete. And then the last one, as I mentioned, is a project that rose from our learning about how FEMA uses mobile homes to, of course, provide dwellings for individuals that are impacted by great losses, catastrophic losses, typically during a hurricane event. And unfortunately, as we all know, mobile homes are not particularly resilient for a variety of reasons, but not the least of which is that, of course, if any major hurricane comes through, they will not be able to survive them. And so it seemed like a lot of money going to waste. And what we wanted to suggest is that perhaps there was a more sensible way of approaching housing after a storm, where one could use, for example, a material that's readily available at all ports across the Caribbean, which is to say containers. Some of these are contaminated and would not be useful, but others are not, and they could be. And they, of course, also come in a variety of sizes. And the idea is that by employing them, they're not only usually free and or very inexpensive, thus making them accessible to locals, but the idea is also that we could start to catalyze local microeconomies, because individuals could then finish these, so that they could be more in direct conversations, if you will, with the local stylistic architectures. So here, as in the previous drawing, you're seeing that there are different examples that we came up with. These shipping container homes, if they were in low-lying coastal roads or regions, would need to be elevated. And thanks to, again, working with our engineer colleagues at Dr. Rhodes, Barbarigos, we were able to start to think about what that might mean. And we also then wanted to propose what a more rural upland unit could be like, and then a more urban one. And we also thought, took into consideration how we could introduce the user to the different parts, so that they would know how they're made and what they're constructed, each one of these little user-friendly building kits has all of the details that they would need to actually build them. I'm just showing you a couple of the slides. Here is the urban layout for a 2-bedroom. This is the most compact 8 by 40 foot long dwelling. Each of the rooms in every single scenario has at least 2 windows for cross ventilation, and we tried to be strategic in the way that we located them so as to not reduce the integrity of the container, which of course are very, very sturdy when it comes to dealing with wind loads. Here another example of what a 1-bedroom mixed-use building could look like. These might, for example, have small shops for the residents. These are just 2 stories, and they might be just enough for a small family. And then lastly, you see a more elaborate unit that could also include, mixed uses. We had different options for individuals, not just for individuals that are building after a disaster, but potentially for those that are interested in reducing their carbon footprint as they do build in these regions, and how they could consider building more permanent housing for themselves. And then I'll just pivot here really quickly to encourage you to make others aware of our very new, just approved last fall semester, and so we're launching our first class this semester. Yesterday was the close of our applications for the next fall semester. It is a new interdisciplinary program between the School of Architecture and the Geography Department at the College of Arts and Sciences, with 2 specific tracks. One is a track in urban sustainability, and the other is a track in urban resilience. And I want to encourage you to look at the Center for Urban and Community Design's webpage, where you can see a lot of our studies there. There are studies, for example, of work that we've done in the Caribbean as well as locally from places including, I don't know, the closest to Pinecrest, I guess, would be work that we did in South Miami and our work that we did in Coconut Grove. And these have always been projects that we have benefited from collaborations, not only with faculty from different parts of the university, but also with alumni and students, as well as practicing colleagues that are like-minded in their pursuits for resilient and sustainable communities. We've always benefited from incorporating the latter in our studies because it's been most beneficial to keep a pulse on what is happening in professional practice as well. And lastly, I wanted to make you aware that the University of Miami's Institute for Advanced Study of the Americas has just started a climate, environment, and resilience initiative, and that we launched our very first webinars this year with, again, a focus on social issues related to climate and the environment and resilience. And so we had guest speakers that focused on the crisis that was brought about by Hurricane Dorian. One of our speakers was a biologist, and the other was, of course, a professor from the Miller School. So I think, and if you want to learn more about some of the things that I've been chatting about, there's a cane talk that I did a while back, and you can just go onto that link and hear a little bit more about some of the other projects that I've not really talked about today. So I'm ready to take any questions that might be out there. And thank you for your time and listening.
Sonia, please put that link on our chat room, the link to your cane talk. If you can copy and paste it and just, you see the little chat, just put it there so folks can go ahead and see it.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and do.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I know we're running a little bit out of time. We're going to do this Q&A here that I will moderate, and then asking Adam to see if anyone is putting questions. But I'm very, very grateful to you. As I was listening to your talk while we're looking for some questions before we go ahead and have Brian lead us in the conversation about Back Bay. And by the way, when we're done with that, for those of you who are really, really, really patient, we'd love for you to just actually stick around for a 5-minute. We're not going to have a full meeting, but we can just go into our chat rooms for 5 minutes and just do a quick introductory session so that then both Brian and Adam can, I was talking offline with Adam a little bit. It makes sense, you know, there was some planning done for it. This Back Bay stuff is really important, but if you just have an introductory session, have the people who are interested get together, then we'll go ahead and send out an email so that before the next Underwater HOA meeting, you could have a committee meeting. But before, well, again, while I'm looking for questions for Sonia, one of the things I was noticing in your piece, clearly, you know, obviously the piece you worked on South Beach, this, the island used to be a mangrove forest, and of course, closer to dune is higher elevation, as you noted, and then you sort of dip in, and the other area was, you know, buffered by now these new structures, the elevated structures. As I was looking at that, part of our issue here with the homeowners association is that we're so concerned about flood insurance rates. That's really the, you know, the nemesis. That's the first, you know, that's the you know, one of the things that are really impacting all of us. And I'm wondering with, you know, with hurricanes, with, you know, wind, you know, you put hurricane windows, you know, you do certain things to protect, and your hurricane insurance premiums go down. With flood insurance, at least my very limited experience in the house I sit in, it's about my elevation. It's about, you know, number 6, you know, it's about the number behind me, and that's it. That determines what my elevation is. But your study is showing it can show the insurance industry that it's not so simple, that there are all these other factors you just finished discussing. Do you think that your research has application in the insurance industry and how they calculate premiums?
I would hope so. That was one of our interests, was to kind of really see what the reality would yield. You know, we thought having, you know, so I should go back. After Hurricane Andrew, and I arrived in Miami literally just a few hours before Andrew did, but wound up being a part of a team that the University of Miami School of Architecture deployed to help the IA and other groups that were trying to assess damage, right? And since then, I've gotten other certifications to look at post-disaster assessments. And it was clear to me then, and this study underlined yet again, that buildings don't perform the same way. You know, buildings could be sitting next to each other and they are going to have different outcomes. And so it seemed erroneous to me to judge everyone by just one measuring stick, which is to say, how, you know, where's the flood water? Well, you know, if I'm sitting in a building that's slab on grade, then the flood water height at 3 feet matters to me. But if I'm not at 3 feet and I'm at plus, you know, even 4 feet, water didn't get in. My stuff isn't damaged, and my claim will be much lower than the guy next to me who has standing water inside of their house, you know? So I thought that it was important for us to kind of think about these things with greater clarity, and that's why we wanted to be analyzing these realities at a finer grain. And that's why we bothered, for example, to deploy groups to go out with an app that we sort of worked on with the Computational Science Division to be able to record what was the finished floor elevation, because, for example, that wasn't out there, and we asked everyone. And whereas it was very easy for us to find other data, that, for example, wasn't. But we found that things such as, do you have a garden wall? What kind of garden wall? You know, what's your finished floor elevation? How was the building built, right? So another example is going back to Hurricane Andrew. The buildings that we saw that had the greatest catastrophic kind of damage were, in fact, those buildings that were typically built after 1965 up to 1992, which was evidenced in places like Country Walk, right? Where unfortunately the innovations that had emerged in the building industry took you to different types of connections at the roof and at other locations in the building structure that made them more vulnerable. And so that's why the roofs would just fall like a domino, because the trusses were sometimes relying on staples and other very weak connections. And so
That's a good, yeah, that's a,
they become more robust. And so there's a clear distinction that we saw after Hurricane Irma, that they perform, even the older buildings of that period perform well if in fact they've been reinforced.
so that's a good segue. That's a good segue to Victor Vincent's question. He's one of our executive committee members in the Underwater HOA and has been with us since day one. He asks, with the study in South Beach around, flood, now that you've identified low risk and high risk buildings to flooding, was there a next step in recommended mitigation to address high risk buildings?
So we've actually been very fortunate to have a wonderful working relationship with both the preservation officer, who happens to be an alum of the School of Architecture and was one of my previous students. So she's wonderful. And we were also working with the Office of Resilience, Susie Torriente, very closely. She connected us with, Betsy Wheaton from Environmental. She connected us with Tom Mooney, the Director of Planning. We had conversations with Emergency Management. And so we've done different things with them for a while now. This is just one other aspect, but we've been having conversations about different ways to think about how to deal with vulnerability and the resiliency of buildings and neighborhoods. One of the things that we suggested, for example, is that they think about increasing their FAR in some of their neighborhoods to allow historic property owners to start to adapt their buildings, knowing that they may very well lose some of the ground floor, or allowing for greater flexibility in those buildings that have been designated as historic to create certain adaptation strategies that might be justified in order to achieve greater resilience. And we've also had broader ideas like creating mini resilience hubs, which I was very, encouraged to see included in the Resilient 305 initiative, because that was in fact something that we started to promote back in 1992 after Hurricane Andrew. It was this idea that, we saw it clearly then that, hurricane will rip through a city wherever it wants to. And sometimes that makes getting to centralized government much more difficult. If your infrastructure, such as, your connectivity, such as the one that we're enjoying right now, breaks down too, then, individuals not only have a physical, but they also have a digital, disconnect. And so by having resources closer by and having, knowing exactly where to go to get help, not only in times of need after a hurricane, but also, before that, on a day-to-day basis, where can I learn more about different programs, whether it's mortgage programs or, assistance programs of some sort to rehab my building, or other social programs that might be out there to help community members. So we've had a very healthy dialogue that I hope will continue.
Well, Dr. Chao, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your leadership, within the School of Architecture and across the university in an interdisciplinary way. Thank you for taking the students out into the community to help them problem solve. And I know you're really busy. I know you're a really busy person directing programs and centers, but you're a natural for the Underwater HOA. So, you're always welcome. You're always welcome on the first Wednesday of every month to join us at 7 o'clock and partake in the conversation. So thank you again for taking time to share your expertise with us tonight. Brian, if you would, lead us please in this Back Bay discussion. We can do it maybe for about 15 minutes or so, just to respect other folks' time. And let's, through the chat room, Adam, give information for folks, how they can participate beyond this conversation, so that we can get our stuff to the Army Corps of Engineers in the next few weeks before the 20th. And then we'll conclude with Adam in showing us how to go into these 2 rooms so that we can just get to know the committees and then plan for the future. So for 15 minutes or so, Brian, if you could lead us in the back bay study issue.
Okay, thank you, Sonia, and thank you, Xavier, for the introduction. Sonia, the work that she was outlining here with how we can integrate structural responses is clearly, or how the impact of different types of structures and all that is one of the things that would come into play in this core plan. So there is definitely a segue between these two discussions. I think the best thing to do to not abuse too much of Christian's time right now would be to open the floor to any questions you would like to direct to him, particularly. And you could put those in the chat or something if anybody has a question, or raise your hand. I might just go back and I'll put up, if I can share my screen here, I'll put up from the plan, which it shows the 4 components to the plan that the Corps has put out. And I think that there was one key point while we're waiting for questions that Christian explicitly mentioned, that the scope of the project and the proposal was limited, in that the Corps looked at specific areas and had a specific suite of solutions and problems that they were looking at. And so one of the things that I think that the county would be interested in is that those of us that have much more local experience and a holistic understanding of things that happen in Miami-Dade County would be to try to understand and try to get a grasp on how this and other pieces of work that are being done in the county might tie together, and how we can develop something from this that approaches a comprehensive plan, because obviously this isn't in that sense. So I don't know, so I'll just, while I scroll down here to the report up. You can download the report from the Corps' website if you want to see up 460 pages of it. But let me see, I went too far. I was going to show one thing I think that people would like to see, as we are a South Dade-based organization. You'll notice that the whole focus of this, primarily in terms of their major structural changes or protective measures, is in North Dade, north of the Rickenbacker Causeway. And with the exception of some work being done on the floodplain down by Cutler Bay. And this produces something that is interesting. This is if you all can see my screen here, this is the pre-flood, this is the flooding forecast with no, oh no, I'm sorry, this is the inundation forecast. I'm sorry, I'm having a little trouble moving up and down here. This is the flooded, no project, worst case flooding with 4 foot of sea level rise and a 100-year storm for Miami-Dade County. You'll notice, Christian, maybe you can address after I get done with this little introduction, why these plots that showed the flooding cut out where they did. I personally would like to see the whole scale of Biscayne Bay to see what the runs look like. Basically, you see that even though you don't even see what impact this project down in Cutler Bay had locally there, if there was any impact. But you see, this is the no plan flood inundation boundary, and then this is the flood inundation. Now, if you go back and forth between these, which I won't do because, as you see, I tend to overshoot and then have to fiddle around looking for it. But the structural things that they did in North Dade by their modeling severely or considerably cut back the inundation in North Dade. However, in this plan, there is essentially no mitigation of inundation in South Dade. So I think that this is something that we need to be clear what it's. Maybe Christian might be able to address this too. I understand that they couldn't propose a comprehensive plan for the whole county, or they weren't doing that. They had to kind of choose particular areas. But as if this is what's done, it's, you know, we didn't get the big impacts, which include large flood barriers, storm, you know, barriers across canals and all that. But also there is in South Dade, but there is no mitigation of inundation in the plan for South Dade. And again, the plots don't really cover down to where this work was done in color base. We don't really know. But one thing I will say before I turn it over, if anybody has questions, or for Christian to have some comments to the questions I threw out there, is that my expertise in this is in terms of storm surge flooding and the hydrodynamics of things. And I have to say that I was impressed with the analysis that the Corps did in that regard. With their limited scope, they did what I think most serious scientists would do in terms of understanding what the storm surge flood risk would be for Miami-Dade County. They did a strong job of using up-to-date science to develop these scenarios. As I mentioned, though, they're limited in scope. We don't know anything about connectivity, and we don't know anything about how these systems affect the long-term, day-to-day functioning of the Biscayne Bay ecosystem, or water system. And I think that's another area that we need to look closely at, because I want to close with my comments, or sort of my here is that recall that the original replumbing of the Everglades was a storm flood protection plan developed by the Corps of Engineers to protect South Florida from flood events. It essentially has succeeded to a large degree in that goal. However, where it failed was not in the protection from severe flooding that it provided from tropical storm impacts or heavy rainfall events. It was in the day-to-day effects on the water quality and the ecosystems of South Florida. Once again, this is not in the Corps' analysis. No looking at long-term day-to-day things. It's a storm event plan. And I think that we need to be very careful about how we plan. It's this undoubtedly, this may be a very excellent plan for that, but quite often these things don't, or the Corps' history in South Florida has been that the major project that they undertook, one of the two major projects, don't fail because they don't do what they plan to. They fail because they didn't fully understand all the associated impacts. So anyway, Christian, if you have any comments on where I said with that, I'll stop sharing now.
Yeah, I'll maybe just comment or react to some really insightful comments by Brian, and I see at least one question in the chat from Victor, so I'll try to address those quickly. But I want to maybe back up, and yeah, forgive me for trying to put so much information in a very short time earlier. Hopefully some of you have been able to tune into more detailed explanations, but yeah, Brian brings up a lot of really great points as it relates to the focus of proposed measures in near downtown and in North Miami-Dade County. My understanding, and I say my understanding because I started with the office just in September, and this process kicked off before I joined the office, but it's the Army Corps' process for determining the amount of flood risk in an area has a lot to do, they run models and they run sort of scenarios of different storms of the future with a certain amount of sea level rise to see where that damage would be greatest based on a lot of what Dr. Chao was just describing. There had to be a lot of assumptions made about first floor elevations of buildings, and it obviously depends on how what elevation, ground elevation buildings or homes are. And you can tell by those maps that Brian, you're showing without any measures being implemented, just how extensive the flooding was along our canals, like the Miami River, the Little River, the Biscayne Canal, further north. And so I think one of the products, along with that social vulnerability index, so it was really the two factors combined that led to the 7 focus areas. But I think one of the reasons that there were 6 of those focus areas kind of concentrated in the northern part of the county is because the extensive flooding that was tied to storm surge being able to go up and overtopping canals, as well as the more expensive and the more, I guess, dense properties and the more density of buildings and infrastructure that was at risk in those areas vulnerable to flooding. And simply, areas like Brickell and downtown, obviously, when you try to compute the total damage, you have to a big part of that is heavily dependent on the value of the building of itself and the property value. So that does, and it's something that the county has been looking closely at and concerned. But it's true that with such a limited scope, we recognize that as the county that it is not, it's certainly not a cure-all, and it is very narrow in that it is looking at storm surge specifically, and not so much looking at mitigating impacts from simply extreme rainfall or tidal flooding. And I'll add just one other point about the timing of this. So this is a 3-year study, and it's at the end of the day, it's a feasibility report. And so just to put things in perspective, for those flood walls and storm surge barriers that are proposed in this draft plan, there are several sort of hoops to jump for the community before any sort of construction would begin. And so, there requires authorization from Congress following the September 2021 report. Then there's another phase what the Army Corps calls their pre-construction engineering and design phase, PED or PED, which could take another 2 years, where they really dive in deeper and look more closely at individual buildings and sort of verify a lot of assumptions that had to get made in these higher level analyses. And then beyond that, this is what's known as a programmatic environmental impact statement. And what that means is that, there's a series of federal, national environmental policy acts, NEPA requirements. A lot of analysis has to get done to determine what the sort of impacts of these proposed measures might be on all sorts of resources, including water quality and Biscayne Bay and habitat and such. And this draft report is as high level and I guess course of analysis as it gets, but it would require several more sort of rounds of environmental impact statement and further modeling and analysis to assess the true impacts. So what I'm trying to say is that while some of the measures proposed in the plan are a little more straightforward or sort of uncontroversial, you might say, like flood proofing our hospital, something pretty much agreed that would be a good idea. Those types of measures might be able to move forward more quickly in the next couple of years should multiple approvals happen. But something like those, the proposed flood walls, even just knowing the amount of approvals and additional analysis that would have to occur, Army Corps is telling us construction for something like that, their kind of rough estimate wouldn't begin until 2035. So these really big projects, these big civil works projects, they're sort of, this is where in the very initial stage, if there were anything to even get approved, the county and other local governments would ultimately have to sign basically a partnership agreement agreeing to these sorts of things down the line should it kind of move forward. But I will say that what the county sees as a big value here is the study itself and the really intense and well, the risk analysis is very good, even for this level of a study. And the potential is that if the study gets sort of approved for the next step, there's the possibility of getting what we call a 65-35 cost share. So for, not even including the walls or the storm surge areas, but for other aspects of the plan, like elevating homes or floodproofing critical infrastructure, there's the opportunity to have the federal government fund 65% of that, where the 35% is then funded by the local government. So the opportunity for that level of federal support for measures that the community and the county and others are in favor of, that is one of the sort of positives and things we're trying to remember as we work through what is a very tricky and delicate process. So I'll stop there, and I've been talking a bit and see if there's other questions here or other reactions or comments.
Thank you, Christian. I guess listening to your response, and I think it's on target. I guess I'm concerned after hearing that a bit more. It's not a NIMBY complaint, it's a WIMBY complaint, which is why not in my backyard, in the sense that this is sold as being a Biscayne Back Bay plan for Miami-Dade County. And aside from some, what would appear to be second thought, throwing in some wetland restoration down in Cutler Bay, which I think all of us would support, which looks good, right? Environmental, nice wetland project down there. This is really a North Biscayne Bay plan. And where is the South Biscayne Bay plan? All of the protection benefits are happening in North Bay, and there's nothing south of the Rickenbacker. So I think that my concern is the county should look seriously about, maybe this is what we can discuss, whether really stressing that this is not the plan for the rest of the bay. This is the plan for the rest of the county. This is a plan for justifiably, reasonably focused. Well, let's not sell it as a whole Miami-Dade County plan, because they didn't even bother to show what the flood impacts were in the rest of the area that they showed in the first slide, right? I mean, they don't even show the rest of the wetland, what it did for flooding. How is that? I mean, that was an obvious oversight, but it's a telling one to me. It's like you're saying this is what you're looking at, and they don't even put it on their flood map. I suspect it's because it doesn't have, they didn't, I mean, you can see that in the maps that I showed, this figure 2, figure 3, that there was almost no benefit to the project in that area between downtown and Pinecrest, right? Of course, we don't have 20-foot high flood walls being built in our neighborhoods, which is of course going to be a controversial thing to push forward. Not saying, I'm not putting it's just going to be, and we have to make hard choices. I think everybody in this association understands that. And what those choices are not always going to be pleasant. So I'm not trying to say that that's off the table, but I'm just saying that we haven't been confronted with that here because we're also not confronted with a plan that actually addresses South Dade. Anybody else want to comment on anything related to that?
Yeah, I just really quickly agree with Brian's observations. I think it's somewhat telling and concerning to see that a lot of the focus is in the northern part of the county. And so as a way of encouraging the office as well as the Corps to perhaps redirect some of their attention, not to say that the northern parts of the county aren't very worthy of your a consideration, but there's the other half of the county that is also looking for, you know, care and thoughtful consideration. And so it would be, I think, beneficial for this study to expand its scope of work and think, or at least make more evident perhaps things that they have studied, or further develop things where they may have initiated them, so that the rest of the county is also being thought about and addressed.
Yeah, I appreciate the additional insight and comments. I'll say that yeah, so the Army Corps has this limited scopes and budget for their study, and you know, what's interesting is they've done this type of study in other locations across the country. So in Norfolk, Charleston, they're doing a similar study for Monroe County and the Keys. And one thing that we are trying to convey to them, and also our, you know, our many stakeholders and partners, is that you know, Miami-Dade County by far has the most risk and the most people at risk compared to those others. And so in some sense, yeah, I mean, you guys are absolutely right that you know, this is a kind of a set process and approach for a study that you know, can only do so much. And so just by the nature of just how vulnerable we are as a region, yeah, they were forced to sort of narrow it down more so. But what they have told us is that absolutely, I hope you all will make the comments that are being expressed here formalized, because as I understand it, part of the report will include a section where the Corps will outline basically areas for further study. So not just physical areas, which you could obviously argue need further study and consideration, but also just other factors or issues that might not be covered in this study. So it's something that the county is, you know, very aware of. Like I said, this is kind of one piece of the larger adaptation to flooding and sea level rise puzzle, but it's a really big one, a really important one, and we want to do our best. So I'd encourage everyone to make your voice heard in this process, and you know, we'll be trying to facilitate that conversation as much as we can. But yeah, I appreciate your comments. I see one or two other questions in the chat. Let's see. One question: is there any chance of anyone carrying out a similar scale project, or is it the Army Corps engineers plan, or nothing? That's a great question. You know, the total cost of this proposed plan is $4.5 billion. I think just given, yeah, the history of South Florida, how involved the Army Corps of Engineers has been in our primary canal system and flood control structures in partnership with our state agencies, the South Florida Water Management District. We won't, you know, there's really not really any major projects of this scale possible without some sort of consultation with the Army Corps of Engineers and South Florida Water Management District, just because they play such a pivotal role in managing how water flows in our community, you know, from Everglades, south and east, through our canals, etc. So, you know, we're hopeful that there are other avenues and ways that might come about, and there's inevitably some solution we haven't even thought of yet. But when it comes to looking at flood risk in Miami-Dade County, the Army Corps of Engineers is, you know, kind of one of those partners that the county has partnered with for decades and sees that continuing into the future. And there's, I'll just say, some of the same issues that we're running into with what feels like, you know, personally, I'll say this, you know, a rigid process for this type of work. Other communities who are doing this type of study feel similarly. We've been talking with those communities to see if there are these issues with just the process, maybe there should be some reforms so that it's can be done better in the future. I see another question from Victor.
I think Victor had a question. I was just going to share the map real quick that shows again the answer to his question about the only project plan is this this little red area down here by Cutler Bay. I guess is that the area that you were talking about, Saga Bay?
Yep.
Well, I know that's far remote from the green and the pink areas that we're seeing in that map. So I didn't know if that was particularly because we know that the Saga Bay area had a lot of problems after Hurricane Andrew. If that was something, I see Sonia nodding her head up and down, if that was particularly to address that. I have friends with homes in there. They've already had to create new foundations and lift up their homes. And I don't know what else they're looking in that area to address those problems.
Yeah.
If I can comment really briefly. So yeah, that Cutler Bay area, really I apologize, I don't know exactly where Saga Bay falls within that. But for Cutler Bay, the proposed plan has both the mangrove restoration, it's kind of like the northeastern corner of that shaded area, but then also within that shaded area, the current tentatively selected plan calls for elevating of 400 homes and the floodproofing of about 700 non-residential structures. So there's a couple of different measures being proposed for that focus area of Cutler Bay. They're calling it Cutler Bay as a focus area because that's a majority is within the town of Cutler Bay, but it might not be exactly the town of Cutler Bay jurisdiction.
I guess I'm a little more cynical. I feel like I have the feeling that this was included essentially to put something on South Dade on the map. And, you know, it's a focus, the focus area. I mean, we know that was where the northern eye wall of Andrew went through. So I'm sure the flooding there was pretty severe because that's really the only area that got much of a storm surge in Andrew. But, or a really significant storm. They got the most significant storm surge, but to say that, I mean, it's certainly not, the potential problems are not limited to that area, of course. And so anyway, I feel that that's just kind of my intuition is that this is kind of a bone to South Dade. And that's really all we got in this process. Like I said, they didn't even include it on their flood inundation maps. But maybe I'm just a little too cynical these days, but.
Actually, let me try to support your premise, Brian, and actually do it from the perspective of North Dade. Policy has consequences, right, across the board, and by mapping what we're mapping here, we're basically saying that we are leaning in and investing in saving the northern part of the county, while relegating the southern part to reservoirs. And that has the clear implications, water reservoirs, that has the clear implications that both Victor and Brian are talking about. It's like, wait a minute, how is this holistic? But let me just turn it on its head and look at it from the perspective of the present day residents of North Dade who are at higher ground, which is partially why it is that there is a focus in that area. So the policy, right, high density, higher elevation, in lower income neighborhoods that are clearly cheaper to develop, presents a bias, presents a path that I think needs to be made visible so that it doesn't seem sort of, well, these are where the two bodies of water come out and we have to address these canals. Second blind spot, I think, is the presumption that when Miami-Dade County as a whole, in other words, the place that provides for the tax base for everything, north and south, is under siege by 4 feet of sea level rise, and whatever the hell's going to happen to our aquifer beneath, our feet, and what's going to happen with property flood insurance, the tax base of this community at the same time in 2079, when we're trying to, address, this storm surge may not even support the county or that. And thirdly, and I think even more importantly, we're trying to do this because we're assuming that this section of the county is going to have this economic boom. Let's protect Brickell, let's protect downtown, let's protect the developing corridor of, you know, Little Haiti, Liberty City, Little River, Wynwood Design District. But if our entire ecosystem has collapsed because now our seagrass isn't thriving under 4 feet of water, because our coral reefs have died, because we have completely continued to have runoff into our bay and kill it and turn it into an algal bloom of a lagoon, which is possible, right? And I know I'm being very, 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 very negative. But if those are the things that we are leading to, then building these barriers to protect high ground without looking at what happens between now and 2079, including what happens to climate gentrification, what happens to environmental degradation, and what happens to our tax base if we can't get 30-year mortgages and our flood insurance is through the roof, makes the idea of investing billions of dollars on building a wall to protect the north part of the county a conversation that should include all these other things that we may be blind to.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, that really important points there, Xavier. I mean, it's like, I read the Keys plan just came out a couple weeks ago or last week. And that one, basically, they were pretty naked in their assessment that the Keys was going to be just, all they could do was protect the backbone, which was US 1, and the key infrastructure, and they left all the neighborhoods to their own design. And in this, I think it's implicit that is what they've decided South Dade. We look more like what they planned for the Keys than what they look for the rest. Now, again, this whole question, what if this plan is ratified, then we have to think, what are the social consequences of people knowing that that the area that is long-term in the protected plan is north of Miami River, and the rest of it, I mean, the money can flow, and that all the people in those communities, the gentrification could just be amplified to an amazing degree. So this is a concern, and don't know what the proper, I don't know if that's, if the Corps is making a smart decision to say that we can't save South Dade long-term, but that seems to be the subtext to this. Do you agree with? We can't maintain South Dade from flooding long-term is what this plan says. Or we haven't included a plan to do it. And is there going to be another plan? I don't know.
Yeah, all I'm saying is I don't know that the Corps has a sophistication to look at the nuances of this community and what matters. They could look at something and say, okay, you know, there's 2 houses every acre down there. We can't afford to put sewage lines to every septic tank. You know, the heck with them. Let's just focus on high density on areas that look like we're going to build. Okay, so you can look at that. You can look at building a wall. You can do all these things and sort of be absent from the context of what you're doing. But just like plumbing the Everglades caused the destruction of water flow and all the consequences that we're now spending billions to redo, the same Army Corps of Engineers, I think looking at not having the kind of community input necessary, which is why we need more than just to July 20th, and really incorporating the interest of all the communities involved, including the minority community, the historic African-American neighborhoods, who we're basically saying, okay, this is where we're investing. We're building billions of dollars of walls to protect this. It's time to gentrify. So all I'm saying is there are public policy concerns to look at when we're doing this, and no one's even talking about actual economy, like what's going to happen to our economy when we are 4 feet underwater. To say, let's not address sea level rise, let's address the storm that happens during 4 feet of sea level rise. To me, sounds like let's rearrange the chairs in the Titanic for that 1 minute when the wind's going to blow, as opposed to the Titanic is sinking. So to me, it's futile almost to plan for protecting at 4 feet of sea level rise for storm surge at 4 feet of sea level rise instead of protecting for sea level rise, period. And I know storm surges are important, right? That's what we're planning for. But there's a lot of hurt that's going to happen before that the inevitable hurricane comes. And I'm just suggesting, and this is a congressional issue, right? Because the scope is limited, but I refuse to be limited by the limitations imposed on us, right? Because the federal government is asking us to ante up, 35% of this, which means instead of focusing on sea level rise and what happens to all our communities and to our tax base and to public policy and to those among us who are most marginalized, we're going to put all our money in whatever the government is going to induce us to invest in. And I just don't know that that's a smart way of looking at this, especially when huge swaths of our economy, our unified economy, are basically relegated to water reservoirs. So that's why I put the two links, even before I introduced you, Christian, to both the Waterkeeper and to Clio before we even started, because they too, I think, see things the way I see them. And we just need to be very vocal as Miami-Dade County so we don't Everglades ourselves here, right? So we don't redo the mistakes of the past where people thinking they're doing good. And look, it's good, like, you're right, it stopped that event. But there are huge consequences for us to sit idly. And unfortunately, in this group, you have among the most engaged of citizens, the vast supermajority of our county, especially during Corona, could care less about this right now. And I'm just afraid that our policymakers will say, well, if the feds are matching it and they did a study, let's go that route. And that's where Miami now decides to plan for its underwater issues for the decades to come. So that's why I'm urging all of us to click on the link that Adam again copied for us, and to put our responses from a South Dade centric to a countywide focused point of view. So that to me is what I think happens. And again, Kristen, I really thank you for being here and for sharing this with us.
I second that. Thank you.
Good. Well, I think I want to give 5 or 10 minutes for us to go into our little rooms. Brian, this might be a good time for you to come up with a strategy for our group to respond to this. And Adam, I think
we can let people decide if they want to do that. I feel like it's already almost 9 p.m. And I know that Victor, for example, had to go, and a lot of the people had to go because we didn't expect to go this long. So
okay.
I would like to have a little more substantial time when it comes to those, subcommittee meetings.
So can we do this, please? Can we please have both you and Brian just send out emails, the people who proactively signed up to meet with us today, just sometime next week, set up a little Zoom call with them and ask them to participate. Let's make sure that we have this recording up online before that happens so that they can review and see where we were. But I think this was, a very, very, very productive meeting, Brian. Thank you so much for leading us.
Well, I think I was just basically, for most of it, I was passive in this, so I can't really accept the things. But.
Well, what I'm saying is I loved this meeting. I think we're getting to, to the heart of some of these very issues. And I think, again, 1,000 people.
It was very interesting. I agree.
Yeah, 1,000 people are dead today because of this pandemic, and we were unprepared for it. And right now, this county is unprepared for what's going to happen in the next 2 weeks. And likewise, climate change is going to wreak incredible havoc because of heat and because of all the other pain that's going to bring at the economic level. And I just want us to better prepare. So I think this meeting, the presentations, and Kristen, your presentation and presence here really continue to advance the dialogue and what we're trying to do. So thank you so much. All right, Brian.
Yeah, I guess just real quickly before we break up, what I'll try to do is I'll try to contact people that expressed an interest in the breakout. I think we'll need to wordsmith an Underwater HOA statement about this, because I mean this is the different issues that can be brought into this are wide ranging, as Xavier noted. I mean this is a 400-page plan, but it's addressing our whole county's future. And once the plan gets approved, it's hard to get stuff back. It's hard to. My experience has been that you can't go back. It's harder to go back and put stuff into the plan once it's put forward. I mean, the plan is the plan, and if they got the marching orders,
That's my fear.
They're going to try to implement, and if something isn't in the plan, that's it. But anyway.
So Brian, just so I can get a little process here, if I could ask the group, if it's okay, you as chair and I as founder of the Underwater HOA, if both of us could co-author a letter, and allow the group, and I know our assembly is smaller here, but just to work in consensus, if it's okay with everyone, let's get each individual member or person, whether you're feeling you want to write as a member or just as an individual, click on the link and present your own. Provide input to us, and my email and Adam's is on the website. If you want to have your voice incorporated into the letter that Brian and I co-author, and then on behalf of this group, Brian and I will co-author the official letter from the Underwater HOA, memorializing a lot of what this conversation was about. But at the same time, and I do that as a process thing because, of course,
Right.
each of us.
There's no way in a few weeks we could come to some kind of.
Okay, so let's both you and I do that, and let's go ahead and have the rest of the individuals do it. But thank you. And then, of course, Brian, if you meet with your group that you lead before the letter is written, that is also helpful. And same with you, Adam. Just sort of get your two committees organized. And I think that would work really well.
Yeah, and of course encourage everybody to make their own statement to the core as well as an individual, and we will try to draft one as a group.
Cool. Well, thank you. Thank you all, and especially thank you to Jamal and to Adam, because both of you have done your work between meetings to make this the success it was. So we really appreciate all you do.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate your time.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night.